Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, a regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me for Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we have Geoffrey Lottenberg, partner at Berger Singerman, Danny Jenkins, CEO of ThreatLocker, and James Jansen, Vice President and Global Head of Cyber Response Solutions at Consilio. We're here to discuss assessing data privacy and cybersecurity risk and the most important preventative and compliance measures a company should take. Gentlemen, it's great to have all of you with us. Before we get into the conversation here, Geoffrey, let's start with you. Give us an overview where you sit within the cyber ecosystem.
Sure. So I'm an intellectual property and technology lawyer, and I counsel generally corporate clients on cybersecurity matters as well as IP matters. But when it comes to cybersecurity, it's typically compliance as well as data privacy issues, and then also work on breach response and dealing with insurance companies and cybersecurity vendors and otherwise, I'm a full-service IP lawyer.
Yep, you certainly have your hands full there. Danny, tell us about ThreatLocker.
So we're an endpoint protection platform, but we focus on on zero trust and least privilege. So rather than trying to block everything that's potentially bad in the world, we say what's needed in a business, and we block everything else.
And James, tell us about Consilio.
Sure. So Consilio is a global e-discovery and legal consulting organization. Our piece of the business focuses on helping organizations that have been impacted by data incidents and ensuring that they can comply with regulatory and global frameworks.
Let's get into the threat landscape here for a moment, Geoffrey. From the legal perspective, how has the cyber landscape evolved? Because the technology is just, more technology begets more technology with each iteration of innovation.
Absolutely. So the top threat for 2024 is ransomware. And that's sort of a broad category of types of attacks. And one of the questions is how do those attacks happen? And what we're seeing is most of the time there's some sort of social engineering involved in some way. Sometimes there are direct technological attacks that occur, but a lot of times they use social engineering to invade the networks. And what we're seeing now is the use of AI to assist the threat actors in executing those social engineering tactics, whether that's using AI to mimic how emails and text messages are sent throughout the company, or use AI to detect network anomalies that they can exploit. There's many different ways that can happen. But ransomware continues to be the biggest threat right now.
Yeah, and Danny, that's really what the challenge is when AI is being leveraged by both the good and bad actors. And it comes back to Geoffrey's point, ransomware and data. It's all about data. And so the question is, when you're assessing data security and privacy risks, how do you manage that before the incident occurs? It feels as if it's a cat and mouse game.
I think that's it. And AI has made it even worse, because 2 years ago, you didn't need to be a developer to write ransomware. You could go out onto the internet, you could buy it, but it would be detected. If you were a developer, you could write unique ransomware that wasn't detectable. Today, you can use AI to write ransomware, to write reverse shells, to gain access to someone's systems in record time. And every time you create it, it's unique and is not detectable. So we're in this cat and mouse or rat race, if you like, between the good and the bad. And now suddenly the bad guys have just got big engines in their car, and they're running a lot faster.
Yeah, and so James, when you think about this, there really is that convergence of data security and privacy risk, and it's across the entire organization. It's not siloed into the tech function itself. This is something that business leaders across every vertical need to assess their risk in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's no longer an IT risk. It's no longer something sort of pushed to the side from a security standpoint. It really needs to be a holistic approach from an organization as they consider how they're going to tackle this. It's as Danny mentioned, it's continuously evolving. As Geoffrey mentioned, the deep fakes are real. Earlier this year, there was an incident where someone in the finance department, because of a deep fake, transferred $25 million out of the organization. And so there really has to be both a technical and non-technical approach to this. And what we've seen from our clients really is this idea that information governance, your data privacy attorneys and your CISOs are really coming together and having conversations more than they would have had in the past to try to thwart these risks to the organization.
Right, and James, it's one thing to mitigate the response and develop a governance and risk management strategy, but incidents, and if they do actually turn into confirmed breaches, they do occur. So when you think about the response side of it, how are you advising clients?
Yeah, so I'll even take a step back before the incident happens. It's thinking first about your data retention policy. So we talk about the technical piece. We talk about understanding your privacy risk, where you work, geographically in the world, but also thinking about how you manage your data. Because if you don't, if you have a defensible process for getting rid of data you don't need, that's data that a threat actor can't take. But I think when you think about an incident, I think what's important is two things. One, and I think Danny may get into this a little bit more, is that one is that you're not going to know everything immediately, and you need to have a thorough process to move through what has happened so that you can meet regulatory requirements and answer those questions to state AGs or other individuals. But the full business needs to be involved in that process. And it's going to, again, just like you're planning from a risk management standpoint, you're also getting all those folks at the table when an incident does happen so that you can manage that incident appropriately.
Yeah, and Danny, follow on with that then. So what is the best approach?
So I think, first of all, incidents are going to happen every day. What the difference between an incident and a major attack or a major incident is how and what controls you have in the middle. So I saw one of the big public companies' strategy appears to be every time they have any kind of cybersecurity incident, they're going to disclose it. Others will take, hey, I'm going to make this a material incident, and I'm going to disclose it. If somebody gets somebody's email password, that's an incident. But if you've got dual factor authentication enabled, it doesn't necessarily become a breach. If somebody runs a piece of malware or a remote access tool and it gets blocked, it's an incident, but it never happened. If a piece of software that you installed gets compromised and has a backdoor built into it, but it has limited controls in your environment, it doesn't necessarily have to be huge. So I think the companies need to be saying that we accept that things are going to happen. People are going to do bad things. Staff are going to make mistakes. Humans make mistakes all the time. But if we can limit the damage they can cause and we can control it and we can delete old data, that's a really good point. You can't steal what doesn't exist anymore. Really just making sure people, computers, programs, and data is only accessible where it needs to be accessible. And then the amount of damage when these things happen, and they will happen at some point, somebody will gain access to your systems. How much of your system defines on what controls you have in place and how much trust you've instilled in your users. Instill only what you need, and then the damage is always reduced.
Yeah, and Geoffrey, that's a great point that Danny makes, because incidents, can occur throughout the day, to his point, but there's a fine line once it is formally recognized as a breach, as I understand it, right?
Yeah, so whenever there's an actual loss of data or compromise of data, that's when the attorneys step in and the lights go off about is there a reporting requirement based on what data was taken. Typically the state regulations generally focus on consumer data breaches, but that's not always the case. The key for our clients is advising them, is the event reportable? Who is it reportable to? Going through the steps and making sure that they are reporting it on time. So one of the things that James mentioned is you don't know everything on the first day. So what the trap that can come up is the client doesn't believe an event is reportable until further down the road when they learn more information, and then they may have missed a deadline. Typically, there are ways to work with the AGs and explain why that happened, but it's a very fluid situation. The other thing that's very important, most companies should have cybersecurity insurance. A lot of them do. Almost all of our clients, we recommend that they get that, maybe minimum 2 million, 5 million, 10 million, depending on the size of the company. And when there's an incident, you're also going to have timing requirements with reporting that to your cybersecurity insurers. And that's very important for several reasons. One, you have a legal obligation to make a claim. And two, they may offer help. So they may have a company, a cybersecurity vendor, that will come in and assist in that process as part of the policy. So again, timing is very important. Of course, we would say err on the side of reporting.
Right. Well, I mean, and Geoffrey, part of the challenge is too, even if you're a global company, you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, right? Whether it's on the state level, federal level, and of course, if you are global, then you have other regions and nations that you're reporting to as well. I would imagine that adds another level of complexity as well, because there is no one standard, cohesive piece of legislation or framework that is a one-size-fits-all solution, which I don't think will ever be the case anyway, but I'm sure that certainly adds complexity to it.
Yeah, extreme complexity. So you have to work with attorneys in different states and different countries potentially. You may have reporting requirements in 30 out of 50 states, plus reporting requirements in Europe, and you have to satisfy all those at, almost simultaneously. So again, having very competent breach counsel and breach counsel that has a national or international footprint is going to be very important in those circumstances.
And Danny, once you finally identify the source of the problem, what is your recommendation in terms of preparing and executing strategies to resolve that problem and plug that hole, meanwhile being proactive in terms of the latest technology that could be another vulnerable situation?
So I think the first thing is getting control of your systems. We deal with a lot of customers, or not customers, but companies that come to us who say, we've been hit by a cyber attack. We've got ransomware on a machine. We don't know how many machines it could be sitting on in the background. So the first thing is just cataloging everything in your environment. And we do that really, really quickly for companies. Sometimes we'll deploy an agent and we'll say, this is all of the software you're running. So getting that data and knowing what's happening on every single endpoint, every single device, who's accessing every single email, and then seeing, is this widespread or is it isolated to one user? And that's one of the big challenges we see with companies. They say, okay, a user got a call from someone claiming to be at Microsoft. They asked them to install this remote access tool. They installed it. We don't know the damage. We don't know what's happened. We don't know if there's a breach. We don't know if they just installed a remote access tool and it was shut down in time. And we don't know where else they are in the company. But the first thing is just knowing what's happening in your environment and literally seeing every piece of software, every user that's logging in, every network communication, and then you can see, is there a real big breach here, or is it just one user made a mistake and we managed to catch it in time?
Yeah, so James, that's a perfect segue for the question I have for you. How important is it in terms of cybersecurity training and awareness to the enterprise, from senior leadership to every segment within the organization? I mean, the tech stacks are so big now, and you're vulnerable to all the different third parties and vendors that are part of the IT infrastructure, right? So it stops at the person who's in front of the terminal at the end of the day. How important is that training and awareness?
It's extremely important. I think it goes without saying. I think consistently we've seen stats, 70 to 80% of incidents have a human component to them. Somebody, like Danny said, somebody is giving away their password, or somebody is clicking on a link. So the training of the organization, all the way to, at every level is important. Yeah. I think cybersecurity and understanding the risks, I think has made its way higher up in the food chain in organizations, and C-suites are talking about it. There's now, an understanding that boards need to have a robust understanding of the cybersecurity posture of the organization. It's not enough just to get a one-slide presentation, every month at the board meeting. You really have to understand what's happening at the organizational level. So whether it's the technical piece of training, the individual user piece of training, it can't be undervalued, because I think, as we talked about right at the jump, AI is changing how threat actors are targeting organizations, and employees at every level need to understand that they, in many cases, are the last line of defense for their organization to thwart an attack.
Yeah, and that's why you're seeing the composition of boards shift to where there are more cybersecurity professionals that make up the composition of it, because you need to have those conversations and be able to communicate from a financial risk perspective. Everyone is competing for the same capital to be allocated across the tech stack, across all facets of the organization. I just think to myself, as a CISO, I don't know how I would be able to sleep at night sometimes. It just feels as if the risk has grown exponentially. James, so I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that, and Danny and Geoffrey, if you could follow up on that.
Well, yeah, I think what we've seen, whether it's enforcement actions or litigation from the SEC or other organizations, is that executives within the organization, there's an idea that there's a level of accountability for those individuals. And so if you're a CISO, you're now potentially have accountability and legal liability for the incident that occurred. And that's why I think it's so important, as we talked about, as Geoffrey talked about and Danny talked about, is bringing in the right resources external resources to help you run these incidents, so that when there is a question about how the incident was run, you have the information to back it up, that you've done it in the right way, and that you have, one, the protection of privilege, which is obviously very important when it comes to these things as well, but that you also have the support of external organizations that can vouch for how you handled the incident.
All right, and Danny, your follow-up thoughts here?
I think to your point about CISOs not being able to sleep at night, I think any CISO that goes to bed and sleeps well is probably not the person you want in the role, because that you need to be losing sleep over this, because it's absolutely terrifying how vulnerable some companies are and how easy it is to get in. And what makes it far more complicated is the standards set out by the government are so complicated and so polluted and so difficult to read and understand that you can't give somebody, here's a list of things you should be doing. You need lawyers just to interpret what they mean. And it's a challenge for CISOs, but I think there are resources out there that CISOs can go to. There's simpler lists. CIS controls are really good. I feel like Australia has done a better job than the US in that they've really simplified. These are the most important things you should do, and then here's the second most important things. Not one big list that means the same thing, but it is very terrifying. It's important, and that the board is aware, and that the CISOs do get the resources they need to deliver. Because when I look at companies from the outside, I see how it's terrifying how easy it is to get into these businesses.
Yeah, it certainly is, and that's why we have you, Geoffrey.
Yeah, so the key for me is prevention, right? So this, you've got to do this stuff from the ground up, and it is incumbent on the C-suite to know and understand the technological issues, the people issues that are behind these attacks. And if they don't, they need to go out and hire people that do engage advisors so that they can really understand these issues. But it boils down to prevention tactics like having insurance, doing constant training of employees so that they can spot these incidents. Obviously working with IT on an incident response plan and having that, on the books, and actually be testing that and running drills. One of the things we do at our law firm to prevent issues is we run drills all the time. And that way our employees are prepared, because law firms are greatly at risk. There's already been incidents involving all types of firms, but law firms are targets too. So we have to do that ourselves. Prevention is key. And I would much prefer a client come to me beforehand than after. But if there is an incident, it's all about timing and getting legal, getting technical, and getting the company on board all at the same time, working all the different avenues, and hopefully get the problem resolved.
All right, gentlemen, appreciate you joining us for Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.